The sun hung low over the quiet cul-de-sac of Maplewood Court, painting the rows of identical two-story houses in soft amber light. Each home stood like a perfect copy of the next. Trimmed lawns, polished driveways, identical mailboxes, and hedges so carefully sculpted they looked like they'd been cut with rulers. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone waved but few actually spoke, where the silence was considered a form of respect, and the only sound after 8 p.m. came from the hum of air conditioners or sprinklers ticking in rhythm. To newcomers, Maplewood looked like paradise. To Evan Carter, it felt like a place desperately trying to pretend it still was. His house, the last one on the corner, broke the illusion just a little. The paint wasn't as bright, the hedges a little wilder, and on Friday nights, it became the heartbeat of a community that had forgotten how to breathe. Evan was in his mid-30s, laid back, thoughtful, with a kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing who you are and not needing to prove it. Once upon a time, he'd lived in Los Angeles, working as a screenwriter and assistant on movie sets, chasing stories while the city chewed him up and spat him out. He had written a few scripts that had gone nowhere, worked on a small indie film where he met Ryan Reynolds of all people, and after a few near breaks and brutal rejections, decided he needed peace more than fame. So, he bought the little corner house in Maplewood, traded neon lights for fireflies, and found a different kind of audience. Every Friday night, without fail, Evan set up a white sheet in his backyard, hooked up his old projector, and hosted Friday Flicks, a neighborhood movie night open to anyone who wanted to come. It started small, just a few kids and their parents watching Disney classics, but over time it grew. The laughter got louder. The smell of buttered popcorn and the sound of soda cans cracking open became the unofficial soundtrack of Maplewood's weekends. As twilight deepened, Evan worked methodically, unrolling the projector screen as the sky turned violet. Strings of warm fairy lights stretched from his porch to the oak tree, their glow flickering softly against the growing darkness. Kids from next door helped him set up chairs, giggling as they raced to claim their favorite spots. The air smelled of grass and summer dust, laced with a faint sweetness from the caramel popcorn machine he'd bought secondhand. From the porch, his small Bluetooth speaker played the nostalgic hum of a movie soundtrack, one of those orchestral scores that seemed to make the air shimmer. As the neighborhood slowly gathered, conversation sparked, friendly, genuine, alive. Mr. Jensen from down the street brought homemade lemonade, the Patel family arrived with trays of samosas, a young couple showed up with their new puppy that instantly became the evening's mascot. For a few hours every Friday, the world felt right. There were no HOA rules, no complaints, no pretenses, just people connecting beneath the open sky. But not everyone saw it that way. Across the street, hidden behind white lace curtains, Margaret Huxley, president of the Maplewood Homeowners Association, stood stiffly by her window, binoculars in hand. In her 60s, with silver hair pulled into a severe bun and a face carved by permanent disapproval, Margaret saw herself as the guardian of Maplewood's standards. She had served as HOA president for 8 years and took pride in enforcing every rule, from lawn height to mailbox color, with military precision. In her mind, order was beauty, and beauty was law. What Evan called community, she called chaos. Each week, she watched the gatherings with a growing sense of offense. Laughter after dark, noise past curfew, cars parked along the street without permits. To her, Evan Carter was dismantling years of carefully curated uniformity, and worse, people liked him for it. She'd already filed a report or two, but the board dismissed them as minor infractions. Tonight, though, she told herself things would be different. As the projector flickered to life, the opening credits of Deadpool 2 lit up the screen. The crowd erupted with cheers and laughter as Ryan Reynolds' familiar wisecracks filled the air. Children curled up in blankets, couples shared popcorn, and the whole backyard hummed with warmth and joy. Evan leaned against the porch rail, smiling softly as he watched everyone laugh, a kind of laughter that came from the belly, the kind people forget how to do when they're too busy worrying about bills or appearances. In moments like that, he felt alive again. He remembered the long nights in LA, the pressure of deadlines, the endless rewrites, and the loneliness that came with chasing dreams in a city built on competition. Here, the reward wasn't a paycheck or a producer's nod, it was the sound of families laughing together under the stars. It reminded him why he fell in love with storytelling in the first place. Meanwhile, across the street, Margaret snapped photos through her blinds like a private investigator gathering evidence. The soft crackle of her flash camera cut through the night as she muttered under her breath, unauthorized gathering, noise after hours, Probable violations of Section 14B. Her cat purred at her feet, indifferent to her crusade. Margaret scribbled notes into a small leather binder, times, descriptions, even the movie title. She paused when the audience cheered at a joke, glaring so hard it seemed she could pierce the air with disapproval. "This will not stand," she whispered, clutching her pen like a weapon. She didn't just want the movie night stopped, she wanted order restored. In her world, laughter was fine only if it followed the rules. By the time the movie ended, the moon hung high and silver above the rooftops. The crowd applauded as the end credits rolled, kids dozing off in their parents' arms, and neighbors waved good night with smiles that lingered long after they'd gone home. Evan stayed behind to clean up, stacking chairs and unplugging cables while the fairy lights swayed gently in the night breeze. He didn't notice Margaret across the street, her window glowing faintly as she typed up a formal complaint letter, the sound of her keyboard sharp and deliberate. He was too busy humming along to the movie's end theme, his heart full. For him, it had been another perfect Friday, proof that good stories, whether on a screen or in a backyard, had the power to bring people together. What he didn't realize was that for Margaret, the story was just beginning, and she intended to be the villain who shut the show down for good. The morning after the movie night, Maplewood Court looked like any other quiet Saturday suburb. The air was fresh, still carrying traces of popcorn and dew. Birds hopped across lawns, sprinklers hissed rhythmically, and the sun washed the neighborhood in gentle gold. Evan Carter stood barefoot on his porch, a mug of coffee in one hand, soaking in the calm. There was something therapeutic about the silence that followed those Friday nights, the contrast between laughter and stillness, life and rest. For him, these mornings were a reward. He liked seeing the folding chairs stacked neatly on the deck, the faint outline of footprints in the grass, and the memory of happy faces still lingering in the air. It reminded him that not all stories had to be written, some could simply be lived. But the peace didn't last long. As Evan reached for the newspaper, his eyes caught something new, a bright yellow envelope taped squarely to his front door. The paper almost glowed against the pale wood, its bold red letters impossible to miss, notice of violation. His stomach sank. He set the coffee cup down and tore the tape carefully, unfolding the document with a mixture of irritation and disbelief. The letter was 3 pages long, full of official HOA language, citing unauthorized gatherings, noise disturbances, and failure to obtain community event approval. At the bottom, stamped in neat black ink, was a line that made him laugh out loud despite the frustration. Further infractions may result in fines of up to $500 and potential legal action. The signature below read, Margaret Huxley, President, Maplewood Homeowners Association. Evan ran a hand through his hair and exhaled, a wry smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He could almost picture Margaret writing this letter at midnight, lips pursed, her cat glaring in silent agreement. He wasn't angry, not yet, but there was something exhausting about how predictable it was. He'd seen enough authority figures like her in Hollywood, the kind of people who loved control more than results. He walked back inside, placed the notice on the kitchen counter, and read it again while the kettle whistled. Each paragraph felt colder than the last, every word wrapped in legal jargon meant to intimidate. What struck him most wasn't the fine, but the way it described his movie night, a disruption to community peace and property values. It wasn't just a rule issue, it was a personal statement, one that said, you don't belong here the way you are. By mid-afternoon, Evan decided he wouldn't ignore it. He drove to the HOA office, a small, beige building tucked behind the community pool, with motivational posters about harmony through regulation hanging on the walls. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and plastic plants. Behind a counter sat a young receptionist who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. "Hi," Evan said politely, holding up the notice. "I got this morning. I'm just trying to understand if this is serious." She gave him a sympathetic look and said, "You'll have to speak with Mrs. Huxley. She's in the conference room." When he entered, Margaret was already there, seated at the head of a long oak table, flanked by 2 other board members. She was dressed in a crisp beige suit, every hair in place, her expression calm but sharp. "Mr. Carter," she said, not looking up from her papers, "please take a seat." Her tone carried the weight of authority, but to Evan it sounded rehearsed. He sat down slowly, placing the notice in front of her. "So," he began, "this letter says I'm violating Section 14B. I'm not exactly throwing raves, Margaret. It's just movie night with the neighbors." She folded her hands, finally meeting his gaze. "The issue, Mr. Carter, is not the intention, it's the impact. We've had complaints about noise levels, cars parked along the street, and litter found in community areas the next morning." She gestured to a file beside her, thick with printed photos and notes. "Our HOA prides itself on maintaining a peaceful, orderly environment. Your events disrupt that." Evan leaned back, studying her. "You mean the sound of people laughing? Kids watching a movie under the stars? That's the disruption." Her lips tightened. "Rules are what keep Maplewood beautiful. Exceptions set dangerous precedents." He chuckled softly. "Dangerous? Margaret, it's not a protest, it's free guy." One of the other board members, a balding man in his 50s, cleared his throat awkwardly, but Margaret silenced him with a glance. "If this continues," she said firmly, "the board will have no choice but to impose fines. We could even pursue legal recourse for repeated violations." Evan nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch. He wasn't a man who enjoyed confrontation, but something in her tone sparked that old Hollywood stubbornness, the same grit that kept him writing when producers said no. He reached for the notice and folded it neatly. "You know, I get that you love order. But you're missing something important. These movie nights, they make people happy. They make them feel connected. Isn't that what a community is supposed to be?" Margaret's expression didn't soften. "A community," she replied, "is a reflection of its standards, not its exceptions." Evan stood up, offering her a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Then maybe your standards need a rewrite." He left the room before she could respond, the echo of his footsteps cutting through the sterile quiet. Outside, the sunlight felt sharper. He stood by his car, the notice still in his hand, watching families stroll past the nearby playground. People who'd been at his movie night, people who had laughed and shared snacks like old friends. None of them looked like they lived in a community plagued by chaos. For a long moment, he debated whether to fight back or let it go. But as he reread the bold red letters on that paper, he knew there was no going back. The HOA had drawn its line. What Margaret didn't know, not yet, was that Evan had a way of writing his own endings. That evening, as the sun began to set, Evan sat at his desk, staring at the framed photo of a movie set from years ago, him and Ryan Reynolds laughing between takes, both covered in fake blood from a comedy shoot that had gone hilariously wrong. He hadn't spoken to Ryan in years, but that picture reminded him that sometimes the right person in your corner could turn an entire story around. He smiled faintly, opened his laptop, and began typing. Not a script this time, a message. He didn't know if Ryan would answer. But he knew one thing for certain. The next Friday night in Maplewood was going to be unforgettable. That night, the mood in Evan's house was different. The usual calm that followed movie night had been replaced by something restless, electric. The yellow violation notice still sat on the kitchen counter like an unwelcome guest, its edges curling slightly from the day's heat. Every time he walked past it, Evan felt a little sting of irritation, not just because of the fine, but because of what it represented. Control. Conformity. Fear disguised as order. He poured himself another cup of coffee, the second one since dinner, and sat by his desk near the window. Outside, the street was quiet. The glow from the lampposts painted everything in a soft orange haze, the trimmed lawns, the parked cars, the house across the street where Margaret's blinds were still half open. She was probably awake, too, planning her next move. He imagined her typing up new clauses or rehearsing her speech for the next HOA meeting. The thought made him chuckle quietly. "You want a fight, Margaret," he murmured under his breath. "All right. Let's make it interesting." He turned on his laptop, the familiar hum filling the silence. For a few minutes, he just stared at the blank document on the screen, unsure what to do. He'd always been good with words, but this wasn't a screenplay, this was real life. Still, something in him itched to tell a story again, to take control of the narrative instead of being a passive character in someone else's script. His eyes drifted to the old photo on his desk, a framed picture of him and Ryan Reynolds, taken years ago on the set of a small indie film that never made it past post-production. It was during one of the toughest periods of his career, when rejections were piling up and hope was thin. Ryan had been the one who told him not to quit. "Stories," he'd said, "only matter if they're told honestly. Even the funny ones." It had stuck with him ever since. Now, looking at that picture, Evan felt the flicker of an idea. One part nostalgia, one part defiance. He opened his messages and scrolled through old contacts, most of which were names from a past life. Producers, editors, small-time directors, and a few celebrities who had long since changed numbers. His cursor hovered over one entry. Ryan Reynolds. He hadn't reached out in almost 6 years. There was a decent chance the number was outdated. But then again, Ryan wasn't the kind of guy to change phones every few months. Evan's fingers hovered above the keyboard. He hesitated, not out of fear of rejection, but because it felt surreal to even think about it. Then, before overthinking could stop him, he started typing. Hey man, random question. How do you feel about small-town movie nights under the stars? Asking for a friend who's currently being bullied by his HOA. He stared at the message for a long moment, then hit send and leaned back, exhaling. It felt ridiculous. Half a joke, half a cry for help, but it was out there now. The room felt quieter than before. He poured the last of his coffee and opened a blank script window, thinking maybe he'd draft a short comedy about it later. Just as he started typing, his phone buzzed. Once. Then twice. He glanced down and froze. Ryan Reynolds, HOA villains? Count me in. What's the address? Evan blinked at the screen, a grin spreading across his face. He reread the message just to make sure it wasn't a prank. Then another text followed, pure Ryan energy. Do I need to bring a cape, or just my charming personality? For the first time all day, Evan laughed, a real laugh that filled the room and spilled into the empty hallways. He grabbed his phone and typed back. Popcorn and sarcasm are fine. Next Friday. 8 p.m. I'll save you a front row seat. The next few days in Maplewood felt like a slow burn leading to something big. Evan kept the news to himself, telling only a couple of trusted neighbors, the Jensens and the Patels, both of whom promised to keep it quiet, which of course meant the whole street knew by Wednesday. Rumors began swirling like wildfire. Kids whispered about a real Hollywood actor coming to their next movie night. Some adults dismissed it as a joke. Others got nervous, fearing it would attract crowds and attention. Margaret, of course, caught wind of it almost immediately. She sent out a mass email to the HOA members titled Unapproved Events and Potential Media Disturbances, full of stern warnings about preserving community privacy. Her tone was the same as always, condescending, bureaucratic, and completely blind to the irony that her very outrage was fueling the buzz. By Friday evening, anticipation had spread across Maplewood like electricity. The sky was clear, painted in watercolor streaks of pink and gold as the sun dipped low. Evan's backyard was alive again, fairy lights strung high, lawn chairs neatly arranged, a projector humming softly. He'd picked Free Guy for the night's movie, partly because it was one of Ryan's, partly because of the poetic humor in the title. Families arrived with snacks and blankets, laughing quietly as they settled in. There was an undercurrent of excitement in the air, a kind of collective curiosity about whether the rumor was true. Even people who had never shown up before stood awkwardly near the sidewalk, pretending to just be passing by. Then, as the first scene of the movie flickered to life, the sound of a car engine rolled down the street, smooth, low, and unmistakably expensive. Heads turned. Conversations paused. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, headlights sweeping across the crowd. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Ryan Reynolds himself, dressed casually in jeans, a gray jacket, and that effortless grin that looked exactly like it did on screen. For a moment, the entire neighborhood froze. It was like someone had pressed pause on reality. Then, laughter erupted, half shock, half disbelief. Kids gasped, parents stared, and even the most uptight neighbors couldn't help but smile. Ryan looked around, hands in his pockets, and said with a grin, "So, which one of you is in charge of popcorn?" The crowd burst into applause and laughter. Evan, still stunned, stepped forward to greet him, the two shaking hands before sharing a quick, familiar hug. "You actually came," Evan said, still half laughing. "Of course," Ryan replied. "You said HOA. That's like catnip for chaos." The two walked toward the projector as cameras and phones came out, capturing the surreal moment. Across the street, though, the mood was very different. From behind her blinds, Margaret Huxley watched the scene unfold, her face pale with fury. Her perfect world, her rules, her silence, was unraveling in real time. Hollywood had come to Maplewood, and she hadn't approved a single form for it. Her fingers clenched around her clipboard until the pen cracked in her hand. "This," she whispered to herself, "is an absolute violation." She didn't know it yet, but her war on movie night had just become a public spectacle, one she could never control again. The night air carried the faint hum of laughter, the smell of buttered popcorn, and the glow of string lights swaying gently under the stars. Ryan Reynolds was standing by the projector with a paper cup of lemonade, chatting casually with the neighbors like he'd lived there for years. Kids darted between chairs, some whispering excitedly while others just stared, wide-eyed, trying to process that Deadpool himself was in their backyard. Evan leaned against the fence, his earlier frustration long forgotten, replaced with that rare warmth that comes when a community actually feels alive. The backyard, once just another patch of Maplewood conformity, had become something else tonight. It was vibrant, human, imperfect. For once, it didn't feel like they were living under the cold gaze of bylaws and signatures. But that moment of peace, brief as it was, shattered when the sound of sharp heels struck the pavement behind the gate. The wooden gate creaked open with a deliberate slowness, and in walked Margaret Huxley, the HOA president herself, flanked by 2 board members. Her pristine white blouse was tucked into a pencil skirt, clipboard in hand, the gold HOA emblem glinting beneath the garden lights. Every eye turned toward her. Conversations died down. Even Ryan paused mid-sentence, his brow arching in mild amusement. "Well," he said under his breath, "every story needs a villain." Evan straightened up as Margaret stepped forward, her expression tight and furious. "Mr. Brooks," she began, voice cold and clipped, "this gathering is a clear violation of Community Regulation 14B, unauthorized public events and disturbances past 8 p.m. You've been warned before." Her words were calm, but her tone carried venom. "And bringing outsiders into our neighborhood without HOA approval? That's not only reckless, it's unacceptable." A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably, others folded their arms, waiting to see what would happen. Evan didn't move. He took a slow breath, then smiled, calm, confident. "Margaret," he said, "you've made your point. But let's be honest, it's just a movie night. People are laughing. Kids are happy. There's no harm in that." Margaret shot him a glare sharp enough to cut glass. "That's not for you to decide. Rules exist for a reason, Mr. Brooks. This," she gestured toward the chairs, the lights, the small crowd, "is chaos." Ryan, who had been standing quietly, stepped forward then, a grin forming on his face. "Hi, chaos here," he said cheerfully, waving slightly. "Ryan Reynolds. Big fan of rules. Especially the ones that make zero sense." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd, quiet, hesitant, but real. Margaret blinked, momentarily thrown off. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, regaining her composure, "I don't care who you are. This is private property under a managed association. You have no jurisdiction here." Ryan tilted his head slightly. "Oh, don't worry," he said, his tone smooth as silk. "I didn't come here to change your jurisdiction. Just your perspective. You see, I've worked with plenty of, let's call them intense managers before. Studio heads, producers, that one guy who thought Deadpool should wear a suit and tie. They all had one thing in common. They mistook control for order." The audience chuckled again, this time louder. Margaret's face tightened further. "This is not a comedy," she hissed. Ryan smiled. "Everything's a comedy if you wait long enough." The crowd laughed outright this time, a release of tension that had been building all week. Margaret's jaw clenched as she turned to the board members, whispering something. One of them nodded and pulled out his phone. "We'll have security here in 10 minutes, she said loudly, looking around as if reclaiming authority. But the neighbors didn't flinch this time. If anything, they looked more defiant, standing a little taller, murmuring in quiet solidarity. Evan took a step closer, his voice steady. "You've been running this community like it's your personal kingdom, Margaret. Finding people for flowers, paint colors, and now family nights? We moved here for peace, not prison." Applause broke out, small at first but growing. Margaret's eyes darted around, realization dawning that she was losing her audience, the one thing she cared most about. She turned back to Ryan, her voice trembling slightly. "You think this is funny?" she snapped. Ryan nodded. "Hilarious. You're a walking Netflix special waiting to happen. But also," his tone softened, "it's kind of sad. Because I think you actually care. You just forgot what caring looks like." There was silence for a moment. The weight of his words hung in the air, cutting deeper than anyone expected. Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came out. Behind her, one of the board members cleared his throat awkwardly. The projector flickered, casting light across everyone's faces, Ryan's calm, Evan's resolute, Margaret's rigid and pale. Then Ryan clapped his hands once, breaking the tension. "All right, folks," he said, "how about we finish the movie, yeah? And afterward, we all help clean up. You know, like neighbors." The crowd cheered, genuinely this time. Someone turned up the speaker volume, and the opening credits of Free Guy rolled again, filling the air with music and laughter. Margaret stood frozen, clipboard trembling slightly in her hand. For the first time in years, no one was listening to her. The rules she'd built her identity around were powerless here, drowned out by laughter and the glow of a community she never truly belonged to. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the gate, heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Evan watched her go, not with anger, but with something closer to pity. She disappeared into the dark street, the sound of her steps fading until only the movie remained. Beside him, Ryan leaned over and whispered, "You know, if this were a movie, that's where we'd cut to the redemption arc." Evan smiled faintly. "Maybe that's tomorrow's scene." And for the first time in a long while, Maplewood didn't feel like a place ruled by fear or paperwork. It felt like home. The following morning, the air in Maplewood felt different, lighter, freer, almost as if the night before had blown away more than just tension. The streets were quiet except for the distant chirping of birds and the soft rustle of wind through the trimmed hedges. Evan stepped out onto his porch with a mug of coffee in hand, still wearing the faded t-shirt from last night's movie. His yard was a mess of folded chairs, empty cups, and scattered popcorn bags, but to him, it looked like victory. Neighbors were already out, smiling, waving. People who used to avoid eye contact now stopped to talk, their voices full of laughter and disbelief. "I still can't believe that was actually Ryan Reynolds," one of them said as they walked by. Evan chuckled. "Yeah," he said, sipping his coffee, "neither can my lawn." His phone buzzed with notifications, videos, photos, even a few local news mentions. Someone had posted a clip of Ryan's impromptu speech online, and it had exploded overnight. The caption read, "Ryan Reynolds shows up at HOA movie night to stand against bullying rules, and wins." Thousands of comments poured in, praising the humor and heart of the moment. Memes of Margaret's stunned expression had already made the rounds, paired with captions like, "When you realize you can't find Deadpool," and "The HOA just got Reynolds." Evan couldn't help but laugh. It was absurd and beautiful all at once. His small-town frustration turned into a viral legend. But under the humor, something real had shifted. The neighborhood had seen what community looked like when fear wasn't running it. Around noon, Evan received a knock on his door. When he opened it, he found 2 HOA board members standing there, not Margaret, but the vice president, Harold Benson, and treasurer Linda Marsh, both looking sheepish. Harold adjusted his glasses before speaking. "Mr. Brooks," he began carefully, "we wanted to apologize for last night. Things got a bit out of hand." Linda nodded. "We've been reviewing the bylaws, and, well, Margaret may have overstepped." Evan tried not to smile. "Overstepped?" he echoed lightly. "You mean when she tried to shut down a family movie night because Ryan Reynolds showed up?" Linda sighed. "Exactly that." She handed him a small envelope. Inside was a formal letter, Margaret's resignation notice. "Effective immediately," Harold said, clearing his throat. "She's stepping down. The board will be holding a vote next week to elect new leadership." Evan stared at the letter for a moment, then looked up, genuinely surprised. "You're serious?" Harold nodded. "Completely. Honestly, last night opened our eyes. People were happy. We've been so busy enforcing rules that we forgot why they existed, to make this a better place to live. You reminded us of that." Evan felt a quiet satisfaction bloom in his chest. For all the noise and chaos, this was what it had been about all along, not rebellion for its own sake, but reclaiming the heart of a community that had lost its warmth. He thanked them and closed the door, glancing once more at the letter before setting it down beside the now crumpled violation notice. Side by side, they looked like two chapters of the same story, one ending, one beginning. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Evan sat out in his backyard again, now cleaned up and calm. He watched as kids played on their bikes, parents chatted by mailboxes, and laughter floated through the air. It didn't feel like Maplewood anymore, it felt like Homewood. He smiled at the thought. Then his phone buzzed again, a message from Ryan. "Ryan, heard your HOA boss resigned. Told you chaos has good timing. Evan, you might have started a suburban revolution, you know." Ryan, "Perfect. Just make sure they name the next rule after me, the Reynolds clause, mandatory movie nights." Evan laughed, shaking his head. "Only Ryan," he muttered. The next Friday, the neighborhood gathered once more, this time officially sanctioned, with Harold himself grilling burgers and Linda setting out picnic blankets. The projector hummed again under the soft twilight, but now the energy was different. There were no nervous glances toward Margaret's house, no whispered fears of citations. Just laughter, food, and a shared sense of belonging. When the lights dimmed and the opening credits rolled, Evan looked around at the smiling faces and realized something profound. This wasn't about defying rules or winning a battle. It was about connection. About remembering that communities are built from people, not policies. Later that night, as the final scene faded and the applause filled the yard, Evan leaned back in his chair, eyes reflecting the glow of the projector. "You know," he said quietly, almost to himself, "sometimes the best stories aren't the ones we plan, they're the ones life throws at us." Around him, his neighbors nodded, their faces warm in the light. Somewhere in the distance, the wind carried faint laughter, and for a moment, Evan swore he could hear Ryan's voice in it, that same dry humor cutting through the night. Every story's a comedy if you wait long enough. And under the stars of Maplewood, it finally felt true.